When silence held meaning, the rain had stopped, but the ground still carried the memory of it. Puddles reflected the soft studio lights as Keanu Reeves stood quietly near the entrance. His black coat was soaked, but he didn't care. The shoot had been long, filled with chaos, laughter, and camera flashes, but something about tonight felt different. The crew was exhausted, yet Keanu stayed behind, watching the monitors, his eyes fixed on one particular frame. Sandra Bullock's close-up. She was inside, finishing the final take of the day. The director wanted one more shot, something more emotional, something real. Sandra had been tired, but she had agreed anyway. She always did. That was her way, to give, even when she was running on empty. And Keanu knew that better than anyone. He stepped closer, the soft hum of equipment surrounding him. Through the glass wall, he saw her sitting quietly, waiting for the camera cue. Her eyes weren't acting anymore. They were real, filled with the kind of emotion that couldn't be scripted. She looked vulnerable, almost fragile, and yet there was strength in her stillness. That was the moment he made his choice. He walked toward the director, who was busy adjusting lights. "Hold the cameras," Keanu said in his calm voice. The director looked up, confused. "But we're rolling the last take," he replied. Keanu shook his head. "Not this one," he said softly. "This moment belongs to her." For a few seconds, nobody moved. The set went silent. The crew exchanged glances, unsure if he was serious. Keanu didn't explain further. He didn't need to. His eyes carried a quiet authority that made people stop questioning. He walked toward Sandra and sat beside her. Not as a co-star, but as a friend who understood. "You don't need the camera right now," he whispered gently. "You just need a moment for yourself." She looked at him, surprised. Her lips trembled slightly, caught between gratitude and exhaustion. "But they're waiting," she said softly. Keanu smiled faintly. "Let them wait. Some moments aren't meant to be filmed." That simple sentence broke something inside her, not in a painful way, but in a healing one. She took a deep breath, her shoulders finally relaxing. For the first time that day, she didn't feel like an actress. She felt human again. Minutes passed in silence. No cameras, no lights, no pretending. Just two people sitting together, breathing in the quiet. Outside, the sky had started to clear. A few rays of moonlight slipped through the clouds, falling gently across their faces. Sandra looked up and smiled, her eyes glistening. Keanu didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Later that night, when everyone had left, Sandra found him near the exit. He was sitting on a wooden crate, sipping cold coffee. "You shouldn't have stopped the cameras," she said, half teasing. "The studio won't like that," Keanu chuckled softly. "Maybe," he said. "But they'll understand someday. Not every beautiful thing needs an audience." She looked at him for a long moment and then whispered, "Thank you for letting me just be me." His reply was quiet, almost like a secret. "That's the only version of you that matters." And for the first time in years, Sandra felt tears she didn't have to hide. She turned away, smiling through them, realizing how rare it was to meet someone who saw you beyond your roles, beyond fame, beyond perfection. That night stayed with her for years. People would talk about their chemistry on screen, the iconic moments they shared, the magic between them. But no one knew about the moment that wasn't filmed, the one Keanu had chosen to protect, and maybe that's what made it special. It wasn't part of a movie. It was real as he walked out into the quiet street, the city lights reflecting off wet asphalt. Keanu thought about something his late friend had once told him, that real kindness often goes unseen. Maybe this was one of those times. Maybe it was better that way, because sometimes true respect isn't about being seen. It's about quietly making sure someone else shines. Echoes of kindness. The next morning, the studio buzzed with confusion. The director arrived early, flipping through his clipboard, muttering about lost time and reshoots. The assistant tried to explain that Keanu had stopped filming the previous night, but the director couldn't understand why. "We were so close to perfection," he said in frustration. "Why would he stop when we had everything lined up?" Sandra, standing quietly in the corner, didn't answer. She just smiled faintly and walked toward the window. Sunlight poured through the blinds, soft and warm, washing over her face. Something inside her had shifted. She didn't feel the usual weight of pressure. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about being perfect. She was thinking about being real. Keanu arrived a few minutes later, calm as always. He carried a small bag of breakfast sandwiches for the crew. No one had asked him to, but he did it anyway. He went from one person to another, handing them out with that quiet sincerity that had become his trademark. Even the lighting guy, who rarely smiled, couldn't help but grin as Keanu thanked him for his work. When he reached Sandra, she laughed softly. "You really think food can fix everything?" He shrugged. "It's a start." She took the sandwich, holding it like something fragile. "You know they're all talking about what you did last night," she said. "Some think you were trying to make a point." Keanu looked at her with that steady gaze of his. "I wasn't making a point," he said. "I was keeping one." "Keeping one?" she asked. "A promise," he said softly. "To never let the camera steal what's real." Sandra went quiet. Those words stayed with her longer than she expected. She thought about how much of her life had been filmed, directed, edited. Every smile rehearsed, every tear perfectly timed. And yet, that unrecorded moment last night had felt more powerful than any performance. Later that day, while preparing for the next scene, she found herself watching Keanu from a distance. He wasn't rehearsing his lines like the others. Instead, he was helping a young assistant who had dropped some props. She noticed how he bent down, helped gather everything without saying a word, then gave the kid a small nod as if to say, "You're doing fine." The assistant's nervous hands steadied, and just like that, the tension in the room softened. It was strange. Keanu never demanded respect, but somehow he always earned it. During lunch, Sandra sat beside him under a tree near the studio lot. The air smelled of wet earth and coffee. "You ever get tired of being the good guy?" she asked suddenly. He smiled. "Being kind isn't about being good," he said. "It's about being awake." "Awake?" she repeated. "Awake enough to see when someone needs a moment. Awake enough to step back when it's not your turn to shine." She nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present. As the day went on, the crew began to notice small changes. Sandra's performance felt more natural, her laughter unforced. Even the director seemed less tense. Somehow, Keanu's calm had spread through the entire team like quiet music. No one could explain it, but everyone felt it. Then, just before sunset, something unexpected happened. A reporter showed up outside the studio gates. She had heard rumors that Keanu had stopped filming a major emotional scene, costing the studio time and money. She wanted a statement. The public loves stories about rebellion, and she was ready to twist this one into headlines. When she approached, cameras flashing, Keanu didn't look angry. He simply smiled and said, "There's nothing to report. I just didn't want to interrupt something honest." The reporter frowned. "Honest?" she asked. "But it's just acting." Keanu shook his head. "Sometimes acting reminds us what honesty looks like." She didn't know what to say. There was no controversy in his tone, no defense. Just truth, pure and simple. And somehow, that disarmed her completely. As the reporter walked away, Sandra watched from the distance. She felt an ache in her chest, a quiet admiration mixed with guilt. She realized how many times she had hidden behind the camera, afraid to show her real emotions, afraid to be seen without perfection. But Keanu had no fear of being misunderstood. His only concern was staying true. That night, after the shoot ended, Sandra found him again in the parking lot, sitting on his motorcycle. "You know," she said softly, "you made me remember why I started acting." Keanu looked at her curiously. "Why's that?" "Because I wanted to feel things," she said. "Not fake them," he smiled. "Then don't forget that. The world needs more people who feel." She nodded, her eyes glistening. Then, as he started his bike, she said, "You really didn't want that scene recorded, did you?" He paused, glancing back at her with a gentle smile. "No," he said. "Some emotions lose their truth when they're performed. Hers didn't deserve to be captured. It deserved to be remembered." Sandra stood there, watching as he rode away under the fading sky. His words echoed in her heart, louder than any applause she had ever heard. And deep inside, She knew that the moment he stopped the cameras, he hadn't just protected her performance. He had protected her soul. The moment she remembered 2 weeks later, the production was moving fast again. Deadlines were back, the cameras were rolling, and the crew had fallen into the rhythm of long hours and shorter tempers. But for Sandra, something had changed. She wasn't just saying her lines anymore, she was living them. Every word came from a place inside her that she hadn't touched in years. People noticed. The director noticed. Even the quiet assistants whispered about how her expressions now carried real emotion, something that couldn't be directed. Keanu never mentioned what had happened that night. He didn't need to. He simply stayed close when she needed silence, joked lightly when the air grew heavy, and always made sure everyone around was treated kindly. His presence had become the calm heartbeat of the set. One afternoon, as they filmed a particularly emotional sequence, Sandra found herself lost in the scene. She was supposed to cry on cue, but the tears came before she even realized. When the director called cut, the room stayed silent. She turned to see Keanu standing just behind the camera, his eyes soft with quiet understanding. He didn't applaud, didn't smile. He just nodded once, a small, wordless acknowledgement that she had found something true. Later, when they broke for lunch, Sandra sat alone in the garden behind the studio. She needed space to breathe. The air was cool, and the rustle of leaves felt like the only real sound in the world. She thought about her life, the fame, the awards, the endless rush of being in the spotlight. It had all felt so heavy. But now she was starting to see that sometimes the brightest light comes from the simplest truth. As she sat there, Keanu appeared, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you'd need one," he said. She smiled. "You always show up right when I need it," he chuckled quietly. "Guess I have good timing." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. Finally, Sandra spoke. "Do you ever think about walking away?" Keanu turned to her. "From what?" "From all of this," she said softly. "The lights, the stories, the pretending." He thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't think I'd walk away," he said. "But I'd want to make sure I'm walking towards something real." She nodded slowly. "I think I forgot what that feels like." "You remembered last night," he said quietly. "And that's a start." Those words hit her harder than she expected. Remembered. It wasn't about learning something new. It was about remembering who she used to be before the noise. The rest of the week passed quietly until one evening. An old assistant found Sandra sitting in her car long after the shoot had ended. She was holding a letter in her hands, one she had written years ago but never sent. It was to her younger self. She smiled faintly when she saw Keanu walking by. She rolled down her window. "Hey," she called softly, "can I read you something?" He nodded and leaned against the car. She unfolded the worn paper and began reading, her voice trembling slightly. "Dear me, one day, when you're tired of pretending, remember that being human is enough. Remember that you don't need perfect lines or perfect lighting to be worthy of love. You just need honesty." When she finished, there was silence. Keanu looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You wrote that a long time ago?" She nodded. "Yeah, but I think I finally understand it now." He smiled, that small, peaceful smile of his. "Then maybe it waited for the right time to be heard." Her eyes glistened. "You think so?" "I know so," he said softly. A few days later, the director gathered the team to discuss reshoots. They had lost some footage from a storm, and everyone groaned at the thought of more work. But Keanu stood up and said, "If we're doing this again, let's do it with meaning. Not for the studio, not for the critics, for us." His words changed the mood instantly. No one had ever heard him speak like that before. Even the director seemed taken aback. It wasn't a speech about perfection. It was about purpose. The following days became some of the best in the entire shoot. Sandra's performances were raw, Keanu's presence grounded everyone, and the crew worked with a kind of silent gratitude. People started saying there was magic in the air, but on the final day of shooting, something unexpected happened again, just before the last take, a simple goodbye scene between their characters. Sandra felt a sudden wave of emotion she couldn't explain. Her heart pounded as she looked at Keanu, waiting for the director to call action. And then, before the cameras rolled, Keanu raised his hand and said, "Wait." Everyone froze. He looked at Sandra and whispered, "This moment is yours again." The director sighed, frustrated, but Keanu didn't care. He walked closer, gently touched her shoulder and said, "Forget the lines. Just feel it." The set went quiet. The lights dimmed. And once again, the cameras stopped. Sandra closed her eyes. For a brief second, the noise, the lights, the expectations, everything disappeared. There was only silence, her heartbeat, and the warmth of someone who believed in her enough to stop the world for her. And when she finally opened her eyes, tears slipped down her cheeks, not for the scene, but for the truth she had found. What the world never saw, the final day of shooting had ended. Applause filled the studio, flashes from cameras burst like stars, and everyone celebrated the end of another masterpiece. Sandra smiled for the photos, hugged the crew, and thanked the director. But deep down, she knew the real story wasn't the one that would appear on screens. It was the one no one had recorded. The night outside was cool. The studio lights had dimmed, and most people had already gone home. Keanu was still there, standing near the old wooden bench by the side gate. His hands were in his pockets, his posture quiet, his expression unreadable. When Sandra saw him, she walked over slowly, her heels echoing on the empty pavement. "You always stay till the end," she said softly. He looked up and smiled faintly. "Someone has to make sure the silence gets its moment too," she chuckled quietly. "You and your quotes," she teased. "You always sound like someone out of a poem." "Maybe," he said. "But poetry is just truth without noise." She sat beside him, pulling her shawl tighter. "You know," she said, "that last moment you stopped the shoot again. It felt strange at first. I thought people would think I wasn't professional enough. But then something happened. I wasn't acting anymore. I just felt real." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's all I wanted," he said. "For you to be real again. Not perfect, just honest." For a while, they both sat in silence, listening to the hum of distant traffic. There was peace in that stillness, a kind of shared understanding that words didn't need to touch. A small breeze passed by, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby tree. Sandra looked up at the night sky, half cloud, half stars. "It's strange," she whispered. "People always talk about moments that get captured, but I think the best ones are the ones that don't." Keanu turned to her. "Because those belong only to the people who were there," he said. "Exactly," she said with a soft smile. "Like that night. No cameras, no scripts, just us." He looked down, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes I think the reason people lose themselves in this world is because they forget how to stop pretending." She tilted her head, curious. "And you? You never pretend?" He hesitated before answering. "I used to," he said softly, "until I realized that pretending is just another way of hiding. Now I try to show up as who I am, even if that means being misunderstood." Sandra watched him, her heart heavy with quiet respect. "You make it sound easy," she whispered. "It's not," he said with a faint laugh, "but it's worth it." The sound of a car engine broke their silence. The driver leaned out the window and called out, "Mr. Reeves, your ride's ready." Keanu nodded but didn't move yet. Instead, he looked at Sandra one last time. "You'll be fine," he said gently. "You've already found what you were looking for." She frowned slightly. "And what's that?" "Yourself," she blinked, her eyes softening. "You think so?" "I know so," he said, standing up. "You found the version of you that doesn't need the camera." She wanted to say something, but words failed her. She just smiled, that quiet, grateful smile he had always understood. As he walked away, she watched him disappear into the shadows of the studio gate. The streetlight flickered above, and for a moment she thought about how strange it was that someone so quiet could change the way you saw yourself. The following week, the movie wrapped completely. Interviews began, promotions started, and both their names filled magazines again. The world loved their chemistry. The press called it effortless magic, but no one knew that the most powerful scene between them never made it to the screen. During one interview, a journalist asked Sandra, "What makes your bond with Keanu so special? Is it the years of friendship? The way you both respect each other?" She smiled softly and said, "It's the silence between us that says everything." The interviewer laughed lightly, thinking it was a joke, but her eyes said it wasn't. Days turned into weeks, and soon the movie premiered. It was a huge success, emotional, raw, and filled with beauty. The audience applauded every frame, unaware that one of the most beautiful moments had been left out entirely. But for Sandra, it didn't matter. She had already lived the most honest scene of her life, not for the audience, not for the critics, but for herself. After the premiere, she found a quiet corner in the back of the theater and sat down alone. Her eyes wandered over the crowd, people cheering, clapping, some even crying. And then she whispered under her breath, "Thank you, Keanu." That same night, she received a small message on her phone. No name, no signature. Just a few words. "The world saw the movie. But I saw you. That's enough." She knew who it was, and her heart warmed with gratitude so deep that tears filled her eyes again. No camera would ever capture that. No movie could tell it. It was their secret, a small act of kindness that had quietly changed everything. The letter that never aired, a few months passed. The movie's success had taken over every corner of Hollywood. Interviews, award nominations, fan theories. The world was buzzing about Keanu and Sandra again. Everyone loved their connection, the way they looked at each other in scenes, the way their words seemed too real to be scripted. But what no one knew was that their bond had grown deeper, not because of fame or film, but because of the silence they once shared. Sandra's days were filled with flashing lights and crowded stages, but every night, when she came home, she found herself remembering that one quiet evening on the bench, the way Keanu had stopped everything just to give her space, the way he had looked at her, not as an actress, not as a star, but as a person who needed a moment to breathe. One evening, after a long award show rehearsal, Sandra sat by the window of her hotel room. Outside, the city glowed with life, but her heart felt strangely still. She opened her notebook, the same one she used to write scripts and lines, and began to write something she hadn't written in years. It wasn't a scene. It wasn't dialogue. It was a letter. "Dear Keanu, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe I won't send it, but I needed to write it. There are things that cameras can't see, like the way you remind people that kindness still exists. You didn't save me with words or grand gestures. You did it with silence, with small things that no one else noticed. I used to think strength meant standing in the spotlight, but you showed me that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who quietly hold the light for others. Thank you, not for the movie, but for reminding me what truth feels like." She closed the notebook slowly, her eyes wet but calm. She didn't mail the letter. She didn't even sign it. She just placed it inside her bag and carried it with her everywhere she went. A week later, during an award ceremony, something unexpected happened. Sandra won Best Actress. The crowd stood up cheering, flashes blinded her eyes, and yet, she didn't feel the same thrill she used to. The applause was loud, but it didn't reach her heart. She took the stage, holding the golden trophy, and looked at the sea of faces before her. "I want to thank everyone," she began, her voice steady but soft. "But there's someone who taught me something far more important than acting. Someone who reminded me that truth doesn't need an audience." The crowd grew quiet. "Sometimes," she continued, "the real magic isn't in what we capture, it's in what we let go. This award belongs to the person who made me see that." She didn't mention his name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. Backstage, when the ceremony ended, Sandra waited near the exit. She had expected to see Keanu somewhere in the crowd, but he wasn't there. Only his publicist came, carrying a small envelope. "He asked me to give you this," the woman said with a smile. Sandra took it, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened the envelope, and inside was a single folded note. It read, "You didn't need to thank me. You already did when you chose truth over applause." Beneath it was a small line in Keanu's handwriting. "Don't let the world film what's meant to stay in your heart." She held the letter to her chest and smiled through her tears. The world around her was loud again, but inside, she felt peace. A few days later, Sandra returned to the studio for a small private event, a behind-the-scenes documentary shoot. They were showing bloopers, laughter, and raw footage from the film. As she sat with the crew, one of the editors suddenly said, "There's one clip we found, something that wasn't supposed to be recorded. It's short, but you'll want to see it." Sandra frowned slightly. "What clip?" He pressed play. On the screen appeared a grainy video, a small portion captured accidentally that night when Keanu stopped the cameras. It showed Sandra sitting silently, breathing, while Keanu's voice could be faintly heard saying, "Some moments aren't meant to be filmed." Everyone in the room went silent. It was less than 30 seconds long, but it carried a weight that no one could describe. After it ended, the editor turned and said, "We thought of cutting it out completely, but something about it felt pure." Sandra blinked back tears. "No," she said quietly. "Keep it, just don't put names. Let people feel the silence." And that's how the world saw it, not as a celebrity story, but as a lesson in kindness. The clip was titled "The Unrecorded Moment." It spread everywhere, and people wrote comments like, "This feels more human than any movie. You can feel the truth. This silence says more than words." What no one knew was that the person in that silence had once been lost, until someone chose to stop the world just to let her breathe again. That night, as Sandra scrolled through messages of love and gratitude, she smiled softly and whispered, "You were right, Keanu. Some moments are meant to stay unfilmed." And somewhere across the city, Keanu sat quietly on a park bench, reading the same online post. He smiled too, not because people were praising him, but because she had found her peace. When silence became forever, the following months felt slower, softer, and strangely peaceful. The world kept celebrating the movie. Critics kept writing about chemistry, connection, and kindness. But Sandra and Keanu had already moved past all that. They rarely saw each other now, not because they wanted distance, but because they didn't need presence to stay connected. Silence had become their language. One day, Sandra received an invitation. It was from a small independent film festival in Canada, honoring Keanu for his lifetime contribution, not for box office records, but for humanity in cinema. It was a quiet event, away from the spotlight, attended by only those who valued meaning over fame. Sandra didn't hesitate. She took the first flight out, keeping her arrival secret. She wanted to be there, not as a co-star, not as a celebrity, but as a friend who understood what he stood for. The event was held in a modest theater in a small town, surrounded by pine trees and crisp air. There were no red carpets, no photographers, no flashing lights, only soft music, wooden seats, and faces filled with admiration. Keanu walked onto the stage, dressed simply, carrying no notes, no script. He didn't need them. The host introduced him, listing all his achievements, the years of work, the stories that inspired millions. When the applause died down, Keanu smiled gently and spoke into the microphone. "I don't think of this as an award," he began. "I think of it as a reminder that art isn't about being seen, it's about seeing others. Every story, every role, every scene I've been part of taught me that humanity matters more than performance." He paused for a moment, his eyes soft, as if remembering something only he could see. "A long time ago, I stopped a camera during a take, not because something was wrong, but because something was right. There was truth in that moment, and I didn't want it to be trapped behind a lens." People in the audience listened in complete stillness. "Sometimes," he continued, "the most powerful thing you can do is to protect someone's honesty, even from the world." Sandra felt her throat tighten. Her heart pounded quietly as memories rushed back. The rain that night, the words he whispered, the silence that saved her. When the event ended, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. He bowed humbly, smiled once, and stepped off stage. People surrounded him, shaking his hand, thanking him. But his eyes scanned the crowd only once, and stopped when they found her. She stood near the back, wearing a simple beige coat, her hair tied loosely. When their eyes met, she smiled softly. He smiled back, the kind of smile that carried years of unspoken gratitude. Later, outside the hall, the air was cold, and the sound of leaves brushing against the wind filled the quiet. Sandra waited under the small street lamp as Keanu walked over. "You came?" he said gently. "Of course," she replied. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" He chuckled. "You always surprise me. You always teach me," she said softly. They both stood there for a long moment, looking at the night sky. Neither needed to fill the silence. It had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. Finally, Sandra reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The old letter, the one she had never sent. "This was supposed to be yours," she said, handing it to him. He looked at it, then back at her. "You kept it all this time?" She nodded. "I wasn't ready to give it before. But I think now I am." He unfolded the paper slowly, reading the words she had written months ago. When he finished, he folded it again, holding it carefully like something fragile. "Thank you," he said softly. "But you know what? You never needed to thank me." "I know," she said, smiling, "but I wanted to." He looked at her, eyes glimmering with that familiar quiet warmth. "You found your truth, Sandra. That's all that mattered." For a while, they stood in silence again, the same kind that once filled a studio, the same that once held healing instead of words. After a long pause, Sandra said, "You changed how I see life, Keanu. You made me realize it's not about the moment people remember. It's about the moment that changes you." He smiled softly. "Then I guess we both changed." A gust of wind passed between them, cold but gentle. The lamp above flickered, and the night felt infinite. Before parting, Sandra whispered, "I hope you never stop protecting what's real." He looked at her with that calm, timeless kindness and said, "I won't, and neither will you." They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Their eyes said everything. As she walked away, Keanu watched her until she disappeared around the corner. The letter was still in his hand. He looked down at it one last time, then folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Years later, when people asked Keanu about his most meaningful moment in cinema, he always smiled quietly and said, "The one that was never filmed." And whenever Sandra was asked how she stayed so authentic in her performances, she always replied, "Someone once reminded me that truth doesn't need an audience. The world never knew the full story. It lived quietly between two souls who had met in the chaos of lights and found peace in silence." And somewhere, beyond the cameras, beyond the applause, beyond the noise of fame, there remained that single, unrecorded moment when a man stopped the world, just so a woman could remember herself again.